Welcome to the Fintech Founder Journey podcast, where we explore great fintech products, great fintech businesses, and great fintech leaders. I'm your host, Mike Scott, and I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Nona Digital, an expert firm that accelerates product development for fintech and blockchain scaleups. It's good to be back. I've been off for a couple of weeks to welcome a new little baby boy into our family. So that's why you might not have heard a podcast for the last 2 weeks, but I'm back and I'm excited. In today's show, I'm joined by Trent Bigelow, co-founder and CEO of Abound, and we'll be talking about his journey building a startup that aims to make independent workers more financially secure. Today's episode is sponsored by ourselves, Nona Digital. Working with us to create or accelerate your fintech product means you get access to a deeply skilled and experienced set of designers and engineers that have been building products together for a very long time. You get the benefit of a studio that is big enough for no key person dependencies to exist, but small enough so that you're always close to the principles. And you get the benefit of our reusable component library, which basically means we're often able to build your product faster than anyone else could at a comparable standard. To get in touch with one of our principals or myself, head over to our website, nona.digital, to book a consultation directly. And now onto the show. Today's guest is Trent Bigelow, who's an impressive founder that's set on solving a real problem and one that he experienced himself. Trent showed promise early on when he was an intern at HP. He proposed, organized, and led the HP Student Innovation Center while he was still in high school. He then went on to found his first startup, which was the world's first online multi-account email client. Although they started out thinking they would be competing with Facebook and MySpace to build a better social network, pivoting is certainly something that we need to be comfortable with as startup founders. He then went on to become business development director at Chiral Software. He's also worked extensively as a freelance UX researcher before doing some time as the entrepreneur in residence at Venrock. All of this led up to his current focus, which is as the co-founder and CEO of Abound, where since 2017, he has led the team to help build the world that independent workers want to work in. They are doing this through a set of APIs that make it easy to embed benefits for independent workers in an easy and compliant way. The Abound team is around 20 strong and growing. They have raised just under $7 million in seed rounds, and they are definitely worth watching. Welcome, Trent. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Mike. And first off, congratulations to you and your family. What a good reason to not be recording.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing. You just get all manner of concession when you say you've had a baby. You can kind of just do anything or not show up to anything. And when you say you've had a baby, everyone's like, "Oh, it's fine. It's totally cool." But yeah, thank you. It's been a beautiful experience. Okay, so Trent, I want to talk about your earlier days first. So from my research, and you're welcome to fact correct me here, but it looks like you were kind of already scratching the business or entrepreneurial itch at high school. From your profile, I could see that you were interning at HP, but I also noticed that you didn't complete your university degree. And as someone myself that started my first business when I was 15 and I chose not to study formally, I'm always interested in formal education versus practical experience. It's something I'm quite passionate about, actually, that topic. So my question here is, or my ask is, talk to me about your experience when we think about practical business experience versus formal education. I know this is blindsiding you a bit. You probably didn't prepare for this, but that's what I like to do. So talk to me about your views on like getting a degree, finishing a degree versus actually going out there and just building businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I should preface this with, I think I was an extremely good student in high school. I think I was, such a good student that in addition to getting good grades, I got bored. I mean, you're right. I did find a way to be an intern at a young age within Hewlett-Packard Company, and working just like my cube was right across the hallway from the inventor of the inkjet cartridge. And the reason I say that is like I was in the unit where our job was to identify the next billion-dollar invention within HP that some engineer or some product manager was working on that maybe didn't get the full recognition of their team and should be something that we should further invest in. And so I didn't really realize it, but that was essentially internal venture capital within HP. If you go forward to college, like I think I imagined probably working for HP for my entire life. I loved being part of that, let alone within kind of that internal VC unit. But quickly in going to college, right as Facebook was starting to roll out to the West Coast, this was in 2003, 2004, I definitely got that startup, the bug, I guess, and started working more time on the startup than I did in classes. So I probably wasn't the world's best college student, but that was only because I was working on other things. But I don't necessarily think that being, quote, college dropout, I know we kind of idolize that. Like, you look at Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, there's probably many more dropouts that don't have a company to show for it. So whether it's my own mother, who probably, if she's listening to this, she's probably not wanting me to tell people that this is the way to go. But I do think that it's true that if you're a founder that is working on something and the opportunity presents itself that is more compelling, I'd say I truly believe that school will always be there. I think it's hard to get in, and it's certainly hard to pay for school, but I don't necessarily think the hardest thing is finishing. What is crazy is in this job environment, I think that I can't speak for everyone on our team, but most people have really amazing degrees, but they're not necessarily in the degree that they didn't necessarily study to be, a software engineer. A lot of people are self-taught. So I don't know. I don't think I can make a blanket statement that education equates to success in our line of work in startups. I think that people who are empathetic of understanding customer problems, thinking of really creative solutions. I think that that's a better precursor or a better correlation with success. That said, if you're thinking about going into medicine or, maybe civil engineering, I think it makes sense. I don't know if this whole talk is going to be about what's the future of education, but
no, don't worry.
I hope that we get into. Oh, sorry.
No, it's great. Sorry to jump in. I just love your view on that, because we certainly won't get into much more education. But I love what you said there. You said, school will always be there. And I don't want to make it sound easy, because it's incredibly difficult to get a degree for the most part. It requires a lot of work, diligence, suffering, sacrifice. So I don't want to play it down. But you're right. You don't need timing to get a degree. You don't have to wait for the market to change to get a degree. Whereas in a startup, I would argue that the most important thing is timing. People are important, team is important, execution is important. But if your timing is wrong, you will fail. And if your timing is right, you can actually be a pretty poor executor and still succeed. Whereas school is always there. My favorite quote, in fact, on my WhatsApp profile, my favorite quote is from Mark Twain, and it says, "Never let your schooling interfere with your education." That doesn't mean I don't believe in education or school. It just means that balance is very important. So I love your take on that. We'll move past that. I just wanted to get your views, which you gave very eloquently. Right, now I want to talk about Abound. So it's been going for a little while. It's 2021 now. You started this in 2017. Talk to me about how it kind of came to be. And what I mean here is more with your founder hat on, and most of the audience listening to this are founders. A lot of them are fintech founders. So, did you start with a POC? Did you move straight into an MVP? Did you go out and talk to customers and get MOU signed before you even built something? What was your process like in terms of going, this thing should exist in the world. We're the right people to build it. Now we're going to do this thing. And then what thing did you do? And then what was the next thing you did? And what was the next thing you did? And talk me through the journey.
Yeah. It is interesting. If you look back at the last 6 years of our company, it is actually a pretty linear evolution, even though it didn't feel like it. It all started back in June of 2015. Alex Cram, Chris Lebaski, my two co-founders, and I working on a client project together as freelancers. They're both full stack engineers. I'm a user experience researcher, and it had occurred to us that even though we had the world's greatest client, that treated us like an employee. In the US and in California especially, the government does not treat us like an employee. The government treats us like an employer. And so there was an expectation that we were calculating, withholding, and paying our quarterly estimated taxes every time that our client paid us. And it wasn't obvious at first, but then when one or more of us got into tax trouble, it became, very obvious that QuickBooks or our bookkeeper or, FreshBooks or Harvest or whatever tool we were using, those things might tell us what we owed, but it didn't stop us from spending what we owed. It fell far short of what payroll and withholding does for an employee. And so that got us thinking, what if we picked up where QuickBooks left off? What if this app could automatically, you could connect to our bank account, it could automatically detect what income was taxable, what was not, what expenses were deductible, what tax category, and then set the money aside into a tax savings account, tax withholding account at a partner bank, and then get the money to the IRS and the state at the end of every quarter. And then maybe even give us the forms that we needed so that at the end of the year, maybe we could be like the employees who would get a small refund as opposed to owing a bunch of money with interest. And so that essentially was a 5-year journey. It started out as like you said, drawings or mock-ups, going to founder meetups and doing a lot of customer research before we ever did a single line of code, and made sure that this was something that was truly different than QuickBooks or whatever apps were out there. People got really excited about it. We got a lot of feedback. We then turned that into, I think a really creative, very, very, very simple MVP, which was an SMS chatbot. So you would go online to our website, you would connect your Yodlee or Plaid bank account, and every time that we saw you got paid in the beginning, while we were building up the machine learning model, it would just ask the user every single time. I think it was like more than $5 or $10 on the account. It would say, you got paid, $42 from this check. Was that 1099 income? And the user would go back and, text back yes or no or ignore it. And then from there, we got to tens of thousands of responses from our first, couple thousand users. And that got it to the point where it could begin to predict for you. Then it was a matter of okay, well, can we get you to withhold that money? We'll make a transfer from your bank account to your account with us. And then eventually building out a mobile app, and then eventually building out that quarterly tax piece. And so it took us 5 years in these 3 or 4 distinct iterations. And we ended up, as we were called Tracked.Tax. And, we ended up even becoming the white label app essentially for one of the largest associations in the country, AARP, with their foundation unit. And it was under the Self-Saver brand. And I'd love to talk and tell you how, why what we do now is totally different. The pivot was quite a lesson learned.
So I do want to get into that, but before I do, I think you're quite humble in your journey, because you brushed over a statement which is such a critical statement, and you said something along the lines of, we spoke to a lot of people before we even wrote a single line of code. Now, look, you're a UX researcher, so that doesn't surprise me at all. But what might surprise you is that I speak to a ton of founders every day, and you'll be horrified / shocked at how many of them start building before they've even spoken to a customer. They start investing money into developing a product that they assume and think people will like. And, maybe they get lucky, but that's really what it is, in my opinion, is it's lucky if people like a product that you build before you've spoken to them. Talk to me a little bit more about what that process actually looked like in detail when you were speaking to potential customers before you were writing code. What was your process? What were you collecting? What questions were you asking? How were you validating your hypotheses? Because you and your founders were sitting there with hypotheses going, here's a question or a statement. I need to prove this without creating a product. Give me a little bit more detail about what that conversation looked like in practical sense, because I think a lot of people struggle with this. A lot of people are like, I've got this hypothesis. I want to talk to people about it before I can show them a product, but how do I actually do this? So talk to me about that.
Yeah. I think as founders, we all wish we had the creativity and confidence and, foresight of Steve Jobs, but I think very few of us do. And so I think it is somewhat dangerous to do the whole, if you build it, they will come strategy.
Because they won't. They just generally won't. Yeah.
Very, very rarely. And so what we did was we knew a lot of freelancers ourselves, mostly in the software development space. And we asked them to walk us through, describe the journey of you finding a client, working for a client, getting paid by a client, and then going through that cycle again. And the more that I think that we initially thought we were going to help find ways for consultants like us to get more clients. It's, I think, what we thought we were going to work on first, because we thought that there was a cash flow or a earnings side problem. But the more we looked at the problem, when we asked them, hey, identify the biggest friction of being self-employed, the trend or the pattern would often be, I get paid, now what? And there was, when we asked them, well, walk us through what tools you use, and they talk about how they used QuickBooks, so they had a bookkeeper. And there was just, in general, it was kind of like step one, get paid. step 2, question mark, and then step 3, kind of profit kind of a thing. So there was something there on the tax piece. And when we asked people to describe, I think it all became very clear. The epiphany was when we said, what do you miss about being an employee? And they didn't necessarily describe, getting paid net income, net of taxes and benefits. That wasn't how they described it. But they described the predictability. They described the fact that there was an HR department that just withheld taxes for them, and that when they got paid, they didn't have to worry about things. And so the more we looked at that, we realized that there wasn't anyone in the market that was solving that particular problem. We tried to figure out, well, why didn't anyone else do this? And this was at the time, like in 2015, that was like the very, very beginning of, having, more developer-friendly data aggregation, like with Yodlee and Plaid. It was also around the same time that banking as a service was becoming available, where the cost for an early-stage startup like us, we could actually open up FBO accounts and do money movements on behalf of users in a really programmatic way. So, like, I think that we had the right idea, and I think there were probably a couple companies before us that had similar attempts to solve the problem, but we benefited from the fact, Mike, you talked about getting the timing right. Like, we benefited from the fact that infrastructure early on in embedded fintech, maybe like wave 1 of embedded fintech, it was starting to be there. And so those things, allowed us to go in there and build, to build iteratively. And we, through Alex, Chris, and I all had different ideas based on our conversations with hundreds of different users, or prospective users and then eventually beta users, on what the app should look like. We always knew we were going to build an app. And the way to settle it, which was really kind of an elegant way, was to do as little code as possible, including little as design as possible. And I think that we did like the prototype, like on Google Voice, like doing text messages back and forth. It wasn't a programmatic chatbot. It was just like us interacting with people and then thinking through, like, how do we build out these interactions, like these conversations, and then turn that into a chatbot, and then eventually turning that into a mobile app that kind of did the work for you automatically.
So, if I understand it correctly, you guys are now a set of APIs. Is that fair? Like, you're an API first business at the moment. Is that true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. We now serve companies that look more like Track.
Other apps. Yeah. Okay. Yep. But it sounds to me like what you just said now is that you started off building a mobile app. So did you kind of do mobile app first and then realize, hold on, we actually want to be the infrastructure, and then went and created a set of APIs? Or were you always thinking and building API first?
Yes. So it was always from day one designed as internal facing microservices and APIs. And full credit goes to Alex and Chris for thinking that way. That allowed us to, I think, to kind of what you're getting at, a year ago when we reinvented or pivoted the company, as emotionally, fraught as it was to find a new home for all those users who spent years, serving, it was just a matter of like taking away 80% of our code base, but then that bottom 20% were the internal microservices that our job is to now go to Track's competitors and say, we'd like to partner, we'd like to be a component in your company. We know that this is infrastructure that is hard to build because we've been building it ourselves. We think this is our calling.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So talk to me more about that pivot, because pivoting is scary. We've been working for the last 2 years very, very deeply on positioning. And one of the best, we were working with a fantastic consultant, and he said, people mistake positioning as a strategy exercise, but it's actually an exercise in courage. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean, man? And he was like, it's just terrifying. It's terrifying to actually, set your direction when you don't know it's going to work, and you got to go with it. And it's courage, because we're an established business. We've been going for 9 years. It's not like it was a startup. It was like 6 years in, 7 years in, we sort of made this. I wouldn't call it a pivot, but we focused very deeply. And when you focus, you're cutting things out. So yeah, I love that term. I love that positioning or pivoting is an exercise in courage. Of course, there's strategy and thinking behind it, but when you actually have that decision around coffees or wines or beers or whatever it is that you do with your co-founders, and you go, shit, man, we're going to say no to a whole lot of stuff, and we're going to say yes to this stuff, and we don't actually know that this is going to work or not. Talk to me about that pivoting experience, and you've already explained why you did it. I want to know more about like the experience of it and how you as humans agreed and decided to actually do it. Talk to me about that experience.
Yeah, it was an emotional experience in the sense that we had, the founders have always had the same mission. We still have the same mission today, which is to improve wealth and wellness for America's and eventually the world's independent workers. So that's always been our mission. It's still our mission. But we gave ourselves permission about a year ago to not necessarily be that consumer-facing brand. I think that we wanted to build the brand that was whether you call it the wingman or the ally to the independent worker. I can still see that brand in my head of what we could become. So it was a realization by Alex, Chris, and myself a year ago when we realized that we were spending more time building out the underlying infrastructure, building API layers on top of tax authorities, and figuring out how do we interconnect and make interoperability between benefits and things like that. Kind of recreate the payroll infrastructure on the independent worker side, since there's no infrastructure there today. And we just kept realizing, you kind of walk down this dark tunnel, and you just keep realizing the tunnel keeps going. And so it wasn't so much that we were scared of there's so much more work to be done on the infrastructure side. It was more along the realization of one company, whoever gets this right, whoever figures out the infrastructure piece, is going to be in a position to help all the companies like us on the consumer side. And this was around the same time that we were realizing that if that independent workers, at least in the US, an Uber driver doesn't necessarily feel like they're going through the same experience or the same even objectives as, say, an independent graphic designer or an event planner or a real estate agent or an attorney or an Etsy seller. To the IRS, to the tax authority, they're all, quote, non-employees. And so, yes, they can all use the same, set of products. But I started to watch these different brands or these different apps that started coming up that was just focused on the delivery driver. And this app was just focused on the barber. And I remember thinking if I were a barber, I'd want to go use Squire. If I were an event professional, I'd want to go use Honeybook. Why would I go use Track? That's the general one. Mm-hmm. And so that got us thinking, oh, okay, maybe this is going to be a more vertically focused community and product approach. But again, they're still going to need the underlying infrastructure underneath. And maybe the more focused they are on serving the customer, building community, creating support, building brands and UX and UIs, that would probably mean that they would have less time and less resources to build the underlying infrastructure. And so those two things kind of happened at once. I think when we talk about embedded fintech, if you look at banking, they're adding bookkeeping features at the same time that the bookkeeping category, they're adding banking features. Mm-hmm. And so seeing this kind of convergence in the categories got us thinking, okay, there's going to be a lot of different apps that are going to need this underlying technology or these underlying features. They're going to want to do it in the right way. And then I hope we get into it. This other huge aha that we had was, in a perfect world, how would we build this system? We would build it the way the IRS or the tax authority should be building it. They should be building a central, trusted tax authority, a real-time tax ledger for every single worker. We can dig deeper into how the more we dug into it, the more we're thinking, oh, this really is its own business. Any business that pays or serves an independent worker needs to be able to read and write, not just to the tax form, like how I think tax preparers think in terms of pages of forms, but thinking in terms of fields and all the components that go into each field.
Yeah, fascinating. And, it makes me think of I have a cousin who had who worked for a very successful startup, and you would never have heard the startup, but you would have used their APIs without even knowing it. Mm-hmm. They're not really a startup anymore, they're a scale-up. And that CEO had a great mantra, which was the plumber always gets paid. and his whole thing was building consumer-facing apps. That's cool, but when you're building infrastructure that all those consumer-facing apps require, it's quite interesting. The way I think about it is it's like niching into a bigger market. Usually niching makes you get into a smaller market. But what I heard you talking about is actually you guys are, as you said, stripping away 80% of your code. You're niching, but you're actually niching into a broader market because you're getting past all that verticalization. So it's really smart. It's really smart, and I totally get it. So I want to change gears a little bit, Trent. You shared that you guys are sort of exploring a Series A round now. We don't have to get into the detail. It's nobody's business, to know who you're talking to or if you're talking to them. What I want to know though is, I've never seen capital markets like this in my career. We're seeing crazy valuations for the big guys. a lot of our clients who are certainly not small are, I'm seeing them raising 50, 80, $100 million, which we've never seen before for these types of startups. I think they're justified. I read somewhere the other day that, 3 out of 4 VC dollars are going into fintech at the moment. I don't know how true that is. That sounds very kind of, 66% of stats are made up on the spot. It sounds like one of those kind of things. But the truth is the capital markets are crazy at the moment. Valuations are really great. Money's flowing around like it never has before, which is not just a good thing. There are some downsides to that. So I'd love to know, you haven't closed the Series A round yet, from what I understand. I'd love to know what your experience is at the moment of raising a Series A round. I'm guessing it's going to be sizable considering you've already raised about $7 million. What's the experience been like? What are your observations of the current capital markets? Talk to me about whatever you're comfortable talking about in that context.
Sure. I mean, I think you're right. The capital markets are pretty hot right now. I think that my observation is that they're extremely hot for the combination. It's hard to find like an overlap of extremely good founders in terms of like past experience or really deep domain knowledge or experts in their field. They know something special that the rest of the category doesn't. Maybe the other big piece is that they're either part of a fast growing category or at the very start, like the big bang of a brand new category. I feel like that's what our case is, inventing real-time tax ledger as a brand new category. And then finally, you talked about fintech being hot. I think the reason why fintech lends itself to being really hot is that being in or near the payment flow or the cash flow presents pretty cool adjacencies for other businesses and other things and analysis and also I think that there's a little bit of overlap with crypto, or at least DeFi, in terms of like infrastructure, in terms of thinking of like, again, I don't think that just because you sprinkle some crypto dust on it that everything is perfect and do new and better. But like there are some pretty interesting cases or examples where we're seeing borders, like artificial borders or walls come down, especially where we can reduce the cost of transactions on certain things. So I would probably be in the camp that I actually don't think that fintech is overhyped. I think that there's just such a rapid explosion of innovation. Of course, not all of it will probably be super successful. I think the other thing that I'm noticing, just like as an observation when I talk to other founders, maybe a round or two ahead of me or a round or two behind me, obviously all this money going in means that it's driving up salary, or cost of talent. That's one thing that is an interesting consequence. I think that is happening at the same time. And I don't know if they're correlated, but because of this move to more lean into remote, which is something we've done for a long time, that now you can pull talent anywhere, or at least within your country anywhere. That's creating some interesting dynamics around, finding, attracting, retaining, keeping talent. But also, I wonder what's going to happen to some founders that, maybe they have an excellent resume. And I'm not at all like looking down on these people, but I am wondering, I think that I'm always really impressed with founders, both who get to the big idea really quickly and then can build a really scalable company. That's the ideal scenario. Then there are other founders, I think, kind of like us, where you might have the right idea, but the wrong business model. And you grind on that for years and years and years, and you don't give up. And so I think that what is interesting to me is when I see other people that are maybe leaving Google or Twitter and they have an excellent resume, they're an excellent leader in that corporate environment, and now they're going to try their hand and take all the risk of being a startup. They're able to raise money really relatively easily. And then the question is that if you end up raising a lot of money at a high valuation, and you don't execute well in the next year, what's going to happen then? Are the markets still going to be hot in a year from now? And then two, like, You've taken quite a bit, and maybe you don't have a lot to show for it. So I'm almost, if I could make a prediction, like a worthless prediction would be, I actually think that a year from now we're going to be talking a lot about like early stage M&A. I think will be really interesting. We're like between really hot talent, maybe some good technology, but then not a lot of distribution or growth as a business. That's something that's kind of got me thinking of like, are we going to see a lot of like mergers or acquisitions?
I think we're seeing it already. Like Trent, honestly, I think we're seeing it already, man. I think you're bang on. We're seeing it at a very high level with things like Square acquiring Afterpay. I mean, that was a gigantic deal, $30-odd billion from one fintech to another fintech. It's pretty amazing. We're also seeing it. We see it with our clients, is that we're seeing our bigger fintech clients starting to acquire smaller fintechs and smaller services companies as well, because of the talent crunch. They're incredibly well capitalized. Money's very cheap at the moment. Capital markets are crazy. One of the biggest sort of bottlenecks is the ability to execute against that. So one of the things we're seeing is money's relatively easy to get at the moment, but now you go and raise an enormous Series B or Series C round, you've got more money than you can spend, but now you go, oh shit, actually this roadmap that we said we're going to deliver against, we don't have the talent to deliver. And hiring at the moment is incredibly difficult. So one of the bottlenecks becomes, how do we actually deliver against our technical product roadmap at the velocity that this new capital actually requires? And that actually might be a good segue to get into something I do want to ask you about. So you touched on it now around some walls have come down, some barriers have come down. COVID has made the world borderless, I believe, in terms of contracting, hiring, etc. We have a business. I'm in Australia. Most of my team is still in South Africa. We've got clients in the US, South America, the UK, Africa, Australia. We've been doing this for years. We used to see a lot of kind of hesitation with clients saying, "Ooh, I don't know, we want a client that's actually we want a partner that's down the road." In the last 18 months, that just doesn't even come up anymore. It's just not a thing. It's just not even a barrier. Where I'm going with this is I want to understand your strategy. Every founder that I speak to has a different strategy on this. And how are you thinking about building your team? And I'm talking mainly around your product team, right? Not so much sales and marketing and customer service. I'm talking more about engineers and sundry. How are you thinking about that team? In a perfect world, that team is totally internal. You don't have to outsource. You've got this incredible culture, this team, etc. That's the perfect world. That's really, really hard to do. How are you thinking about this? Are you working with partners? Are you working with freelancers? Are you only building an internal team now? Talk to me about, on the product side, how you're building your team, and especially as you go into Series A, where you're going to have a lot more capital to deploy and probably a whole lot of extra, let's call them roadmap items that need to be delivered. How are you thinking about scaling your capability?
Yeah. In the past, I think we started out with just contractors. And then when we got enough resources to hire employees, we hired employees, even as a direct to consumer or B2C app. And then, when we brought on, significant resources, from our seed round, we focused on building out an outstanding team, internally. I think now we're at the point where, I think looking 1 year ago versus today, the talent market is harder today than it was a year ago. And at the same time, we are obviously, we're not trying to recruit everybody in the Bay Area. We're not trying to bring everybody into our old office in San Francisco. We are open to people working wherever they are. I think the future is flexible. And so what I think we're seeing is that we're seeing essentially like geographic clusters, where today we're only in the United States. So New York, San Francisco, Seattle, I think are the key clusters. I think that there will probably be a benefit, I think, even if we don't mandate that people come into an office, giving people the option to have like we work global access, be able to work together, letting people kind of travel throughout the country, do retreats or offsites and things like that. I think that will get us far. I think you bring up a good point of thinking, like, especially if you design the organization in such a way where you have distinct product squads or product teams. I think something we're looking at, I don't think it's something we've done, but looking at, what if we did staff up, something that looks a little bit like an external team on a specific product while our core team focuses on the core products. How do we think about being more flexible in terms of doing an iterative MVP, not knowing if the client is necessarily going to want that new kind of advanced tech way ahead of the rest of the company, but then not having to pull our key people that are already working on the main product line when we go out and think about something new. So like that to me is an interesting use of contractor, or whether it's agency or dev shops and teams that to augment the internal. I think a lot of founders are somewhat fearful, when it comes to agency or dev work in terms of, one, like, is the alignment of costs, like the cost structure, like, does this get away from us and it's a zero sum game? And the other concern, of course, is what about IP? I mean, this is work for hire? Who owns that? So those are the questions that I know are in the back of probably all of your clients' prospective clients' head. But yeah, I think the future is I don't think we're going to have a choice, to be quite honest. As founders, I think if you want to move quickly, you're going to end up needing to have a very flexible workforce.
Yeah, I mean, you have touched on all the usual questions, and I'm not going to talk about us in this podcast, but it's what I can do is I can validate a lot of your fears, and it's what we're seeing for what it's worth is that we're seeing the startups that are doing and the scale-ups that are doing it right are generally sort of keeping a core team for their core product. And that core team can be, we got clients that have got 70 engineers. It doesn't have to be a small team. They can have, but the point is that their core team, their core product is done in-house, and that's by them. But then typically they have a whole bunch of projects that they need to get done that they can't hire up for. And that's where it often makes sense to work with a partner that you can trust, that actually has a policy on IP and it automatically transfers and cannot be taken, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting though, for what it's worth, 3 years ago, we would quite often be speaking to potential clients and they'd just say, oh, no, we don't outsource. Full stop, end of story. And we go, okay, that's cool. Well done. That's great. All good. We respect that. I haven't had that conversation in 2 years. I don't think there's anyone on the planet that's going, we don't outsource, because they're just going, I wish we didn't have to outsource, but it's just not realistic anymore. Even the banks, even the big guys who we don't necessarily enjoy working with, even the big corporates are sort of going, okay, we need a strategy where we can work with partners because we just can't do it all ourselves. So that's really fascinating. And it'll be interesting to speak to you in a year's time as you go from focused on efficiency and really good optimal utilization of capital into a sort of Series A to Series B round, which I think moves a little bit more into a conscious decrease in efficiency to allow more innovation. It sounds a little odd, but it's something I've noticed with a lot of the more scale-up type founders is they need to transition from focusing so much on getting the most out of every dollar into, okay, we've actually got a decent roadmap now. We actually need to embrace a little bit of inefficiency because that's where innovation is going to come from. And that can be a very painful transition because it's a totally different philosophy. Excuse me. Super interesting.
I agree. I think that we a phrase that we use a lot, rate limiters, like what is the rate limiter? And then I think that, I think in the pre-seed days, we felt that, money, runway, that the dollars were the rate limiter. And therefore we optimize, like you said, we were optimizing for getting the most out of every dollar. And then now it's flipped around to the other side of how can we get to insights or validation in the shortest amount of time. And again, pick what faster, better, cheaper, pick two. Oftentimes you do need to trade money for time.
Yeah, 100%. So that's actually my next question. And what is your biggest challenge right now? I mean, you seem like a super together dude. You're very chilled, which I'm always impressed. When I speak to a founder that's moving at the speed of light, that's chilled, I'm always like, how do you do that, man? So you seem really chilled, but I do want to know, what is keeping you up at night? What is your biggest challenge? Building a scale-up is incredibly difficult. We all try to show a strong face and pretend like we've got it all worked out, but there are things that are sort of keeping us up at night. What is your biggest challenge at the moment? What's the thing that you're finding kind of most difficult / important to solve at the moment?
So if I'm giving you the impression that we have it all figured out, that's not intentional. I think we're learning a lot of things as we go along. I think the first thing is that in terms of being chill, I think it comes down to having, first off, an amazing team. And that's something that I think that I'm always impressed with, bringing in a bench of leaders who then bring in the bench, behind them, and then the bench behind them, and the bench behind them. And so building processes, and not just processes, but also obviously culture that is guided by really clear, or we call them organizational North Stars. They look a lot like OKRs. What is the one metric that matters to this team for this quarter? And then everything we do, or everything the product org or the engineering org or the growth org does, or the ops org, they're aligned around that focus. So that's the preamble to your question of like, what keeps me up at night? I think I think that a lot of people, like when I talk to prospective investors, they're asking me about a competition. And so what's interesting is that we don't really have any competition today. And so that probably leads investors to thinking like, well, is this a real business? And so for many founders out there that are building day zero, brand new markets, they're inventing a brand new category. And for us, basically withholding for non-employment income. That isn't an industry. That doesn't exist. It's a $10 billion a year industry on the payroll side for W-2, and it's a $0 an industry today. Besides maybe what our clients are doing.
I think that's going to be the title of the podcast is building a $10 billion business for an industry that doesn't exist. Which is fantastic. Yeah. I love that because it's there, but it's not there. Anyway, go on. I just love that.
Yeah. So what I would say is, like, I don't know if it keeps me up at night, but the thing is, it's that there are so many different components in building this quote payroll or withholding stack on the non-employment side. There's so many different pieces that need to be built. I think realistically, there are going to be many different companies. There are going to be many different infrastructure providers that build out the different pieces. And so the thing I guess that keeps me up at night is that, it's not so much fearful. It's just more like when I go to sleep at night, and maybe other founders get this too. Like, I'm at the point now, I don't know if they're lucid dreams, but they are like, you go to sleep at night and your brain goes to work on like the questions that you have. And sometimes they're coherent, really great epiphanies. And then you wake up, and other times you're like, wow, I'm tired after sleeping for 8 hours. I felt like I was at a whiteboard or in a team meeting for like 4 or 5 hours, and half of it makes sense.
Oh, Trent, I know a guy, I won't give away his identity, but I know a guy very well, and he's a very successful entrepreneur. He's a really, really good friend of mine. And he's really into lucid dreaming. So he dedicates an enormous amount of time in his life to sort of get this lucid dreaming, what do you want to call it? I don't know, methodology right. And he legit claims that he solves most of his business problems through his lucid dreaming. So, I have zero evidence based on that, but I love what you're talking about because I can relate to it. I can relate to waking up in the morning and just feeling exhausted because I've been whiteboarding things in my head all night. I totally get it. So you're not insane. We totally share that, or we're both insane. But yeah, please do go on. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, I mean, I hope to get to the point where I can have more coherent, productive, lucid dreams. I'm not really running a process on that, and I should. It's one of those things where it's like, some people are like, oh, I should learn a foreign language. I think, the more I read about lucid dreaming, the more amazing it is like productivity and maybe even adventure. But I am at the point now where it's like, I feel like it's like some sort of, whether it's Tetris or a puzzle that keeps getting refitted. I think our whole team is trying to figure out, out of the 4 or 5 benefits that we can design, healthcare, retirement, taxes is the one we've already started to work on, and I think roll out in a mature way, paid time off, all these different benefits. Again, keeping in mind that I don't think it's our job to build these benefits. It's our job to figure out how to make them how to improve the distribution of this as almost like an aggregator of these workers, and then create the interoperability between these benefits providers and then the companies that are paying or serving these workers. And so it's this constant question of like, well, what order as founders should we be building out our next versions of our products or our next product lines in a way that best leverages whatever we've built to what the whole roadmap of what we're building. And so again, long roundabout way of saying, like, what am I fearful of? I don't know about fearful, but like we as a team, we spend so much time thinking through like what order makes the most sense. And the only way really we're going to know is probably by spending more and more time talking to customers and understanding why there's something that if it exists in the market, why aren't they using that instead? And why are they asking us to build it a different way? And then if it doesn't exist in the market, why doesn't it exist in the market? What's hard about building something from scratch?
Yeah, 100%. Trent, I'm conscious of time. It's run away from us because it's been a great conversation. So I want to move to some more kind of rapid fire questions. So you don't have to answer these in great detail. They're more just like quick fire questions. So here we go. So look, building a business is difficult. How do you think about personal optimal performance? And do you have any routines, habits, rituals, behaviors, processes that help you to maintain, and I'm using the word optimal, not peak performance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to imply that I do this every day, but I can tell a real difference on a day where, when I get up earlier, if I can see the sunrise, occasionally, and I don't do this enough, but I do find that meditation does really help. It clears my mind. I'm not as loud and noisy and around. The night before, if I review my own personal OKRs for the quarter or the company level OKRs that I'm responsible for, if I'm getting a preview of what the key outcomes that I expect, to do tomorrow. Letting my mind go to work at it overnight really helps. And then going out for an early morning walk. Maybe doing rowing in the morning, and I don't do that enough, but I can tell a real difference with a little bit of physical activity. And at the end of the day, sometimes it's with my wife, sometimes it's on my own, and just listening to either music or a book. But going for a long, like an hour-long sunset walk. Again, not so much that I'm actually even listening to the book, but I just notice when my mind gets away from me, and then I start to kind of solve problems, and I notice when I'm not listening, when I'm maybe like a half a chapter behind in the book or the podcast or the music, I'm realizing that my brain's gone to work on something really deep and methodical. That's a big challenge that we're trying to solve as a team. And so I always feel better and recharged when I have that as part of my daily routine. And, I don't think I have a good excuse when I don't do it. So it's like one of those things where, for all of us, especially in the last year and a half of trying to do that self-care time. The other thing I'd say that I think is a team routine that I really recommend for founders is, starting the week off right. And it's difficult when you have team members that are on different time zones. But what we do at Abound is we start at 9 a.m. or 9:30 a.m. every Monday morning. We call our team weekly kickoff. We have this amazing tool called All Hands, and All Hands lets us basically kind of run like a live virtual event. Where again, today we're 16 people. We'll likely be closer to 40 early next year. We're able to bring everybody on one place. We're able to kind of forecast what are the big things that are happening this week. And then by the end of the week, we have kind of this, usually it's an AMA or a fireside chat. I really think that that's important that as founders, we create these virtual common spaces for our team to work more closely together. And again, just to respect and get excited by who we're working with.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, everything you've mentioned there has almost become cliche in our time, and it's for a very good reason. Meditation, early morning exercise, getting up before the sun comes up with 8 hours of sleep. These things have become almost eye-rolly to some people, but I just keep pushing them because they make such a massive difference. And I appreciate your honesty and humility saying, I don't do this every day. I'm not claiming to, but when I do, I'm a better person. And I totally relate to that. I'm very ADHD. So for me, it's critical that I do these things. And when I don't, I feel it. So next quick question. What scares you in business?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is assumptions. So I'm guilty of making assumptions probably a little bit too often. I think that not necessarily people around me, but other people out there, and myself included, we need to be very careful and conscious about our first impressions of people, of maybe even competitors or products. We look at something and, our brains just go, it is designed to get to a quick snap judgment. And so I can count the number of times that I would typecast, whether people's or products or opportunities one way, and then very slowly come to a different conclusion, and then realize if I had not had that snap judgment in day one, I would have had this other opportunity along the way. So what scares me? It's assumptions.
I love that. What content are you consuming currently?
I'm not consuming enough content. I didn't intentionally. I got locked out of my Facebook account a while back, so that that made my life much easier. You can't be in fintech and not be on like fintech Twitter. I admit, like I'm reading more fintech Twitter than it's probably healthy. I really enjoy some of the master classes. In terms of like Chris Voss on negotiation, in particular, Robert Iger from Disney about how to be a good leader. And then I went back and read the high output management by Andy Grove. A different take on like having read Measure What Matters from John Doerr about OKRs. And then the book that I recommend that everybody read is the 80-20 Principle by Richard Kosch. Really, really great book. And again, I go back and read that like maybe once or twice a year. The 80-20 Manager for us founders who, haven't managed people for a very long time. 80-20 Manager is such a great book about thinking about 10 different ways, 10 different toolkits to be a manager. Like we're not all cookie cutter the same way. And so kind of realizing for me that I'm I'm all about like defining outcomes and letting people figure out and craft a way to get there and being supportive of that. There are other people that, are more prescriptive.
Yeah, love it. What's the last book you read cover to cover?
I recently reread the book All the Devils Are Here, which is about the 2008 international or global financial crisis. And it's a nerdy book, but it's so fascinating. And like sometimes I'm a little fearful that we're doing things like that again. But it was about deregulation around mortgage-backed securities. Oh man, I want to give you another one. Another book that I am going to reread. It's called Tower of Basel. You can see there's a theme. I like finance books. Tower of Basel is about the Bank of International Settlements. It's about basically outsized and very quiet influence from German finance in our international financial markets. The Germans do a great job of being very quiet and subtle, but it's a fascinating book. I didn't know what the Bank of International Settlements was before, but it's the bank. It's the bank for central banks. It's really fascinating.
This is awesome. You saw me writing down, this is going to sound a little bit arrogant, but I very seldom get a bunch of books that I haven't read. And I haven't read any one of those that you just gave, which is fantastic. I get really excited. So thank you for those recommendations. So Trent, look, we bounced around today, which is great. I love doing that. Of everything we've spoken about, what is the one single thing that you would want the listeners to take away from this episode?
Founders, especially in the early days, if you are uncertain of what to build, spend more time with your customers. We all know this. It's super cliche, but don't go out on a limb and design something that you think would be perfect for them. Start small, be iterative, lo-fi to hi-fi, but just spend more time with your customers and ask better questions. That's a whole nother podcast, but asking your customers, 5 layers of why, and something IDEO does a really good job of, but like that is transformative.
Yeah, look, Trent, it's been awesome speaking to you. I find you very humble. I find you very together. I find you very chill, which is awesome. It's been really great, Trent. I really appreciate your openness, your honesty, and really impressive what you're building. We're definitely going to get you back on the show in, let's say, about a year's time, because I sense and smell some hyper growth coming on in the next 12 to 18 months. Trent, do you like to be contacted or followed? And if you do, how can the listeners contact or follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to email me at TB, like my first and last initial, at withabound.com. I may not necessarily get super fast response, but I do try to read every email. But you can check us out at withabound.com, and we put a lot of content up on our blog. Even if founders don't use us for tax or benefits APIs, there's a lot of lessons learned that we had in building Track, and I'm happy just to have people learn from us because we're trying to build the world that independent workers want to live in.
I love it. Trent, thank you so much for making the time. It's been really, really great. I appreciate the time and the sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike, for having me on.
Yeah, no worries. And to the listeners, I hope that you got some value from today's episode with Trent Bigelow. I sure did. My main takeaway is what Trent just drove home right at the end, which is just, speak to your customers, ask better questions, understand who you're building for. It just blows my mind how many founders do not do this and have the arrogance to think that they will know the answer to this. That's why Steve Jobs was so famous and amazing, because he did, and that's really rare. So speak to your founders, ask better questions, understand who you're building for and what you're building before you start building it. Thanks for listening to the show. It's been great. If you'd like to discuss your fintech or blockchain project with us, you're welcome to book a call with myself or one of our principals. Just head over to our website, nona.digital, and you'll find us there. And I'll be back next week with another episode to explore Fintech Founder Journey.